Hey guys, what's going on? EJ here to talk about um one of the most prominent political figures of the 1990s, a history making woman for Women's History Month here in 2022. She was a figure that was always on the news, always very prominent when I was a kid growing up in the 1990s, and a period that we often talk about here on my channel, especially in the 90s decades in review videos. And that is former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. She is the first female Secretary of State and the second person of Jewish descent um, to ever be in that office. She has passed away today at the age of um, She has passed away today at the age of 84. Madeleine Albright was born in Czechoslovakia in the city of Prague. Her country, Czechoslovakia, was free for 30 years. Following the end of World War One, as we recall, World War One was um, when all the European empires, the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which her country was under, broke apart, and all those republics in Central, Eastern, and Central Europe became independent, at least for a time, until the rise of Hitler in the 1930s, when her family was forced to move to Yugoslavia because of Germany's occupation of Czechoslovakia at that time. Following that, following the defeat of the Nazis in World War II, Madeleine's family moved back to Yugoslavia, but the rise of communism in Yugoslavia and the rise of Tito's government in Yugoslavia forced her family to move back to the UK, with a stopover in Switzerland, and then to the United States, where later on she would serve as one of the most prominent figures in the United Nations on behalf of the United States, as well as the Secretary of State until um, 2000 under Bill Clinton. Now, what made her specially equipped for this job to be the Secretary of State under Bill Clinton was her background. Not only was did she live in the former Yugoslavia, so she was very familiar with the politics of Yugoslavia, the whole Serbians versus Croats versus Bosnian Muslims versus Albanian thing that went down in the 1990s. Those two genocides, the genocides of the Bosnians in 1995 and the genocide of the Kosovar Albanians in 1998, which we talk about on the channel. she was very she was very well acquainted with that. A lot of times us as Americans were not so well acquainted with that situation. We were not aware of how Slobodan Milosevic and Serbia was gaining so much power in the 1990s with the breakup of Yugoslavia. When Yugoslavia broke up and communism fell, it wasn't all good as we imagined. Some of the glue that held those republics together in Yugoslavia was very tenuous. And in the 90s, it all fell apart. And Madeleine's background in that area, having lived in the capital of Serbia, in Belgrade, for several years, equipped her with the necessary tools to be able to service that right. So that was what she was well known for, brokering the peace and encouraging the United States to get involved in the Balkans to prevent genocide of against both the Albanians and the Bosnians. Another thing that she was well known for, she was very well known for her work in the Middle East peace process, which of course started in the 1990s under when Bill Clinton was president. Now the Palestinians, the PLO to be exact, Fatah to be exact, that party of the Palestinians had begun to negotiate with the Israeli government for the mutual recognition of the Israelis to recognize the PLO and the legitimacy of the PLO party, which eventually became the Palestinian Authority, and the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah to recognize them. But and the United States came in later in Oslo, Norway, for the historic treaty, which was supposed to give back the territories acquired in the Six-Day War that the Israelis had acquired in the Six-Day War. The United States was supposed to give them back, and Israel was supposed to give them back, and the United States was supposed to, put the pressure on Israel to dismantle their settlements in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, but that was not for lack of trying. Even after the death of Yitzhak Rabin in 1995, Madeleine Albright and Bill Clinton still continued to push for that. They still continued to push for, that. Again, another conflict that Americans really don't really understand. They understand it more than the conflict in the Balkans. Keep in mind that the Balkans was always a powder keg. Even when Winston Churchill was Prime Minister of the UK in the 1940s, during World War II, he even said that the Balkans would be that powder keg because a lot of the beefs of the Balkans go way back to Ottoman times, way back to Austro-Hungarian times, way back to the times before World War One when Madeleine Albright was born. When these empires, these great empires, like the Austro-Hungarians and like the Ottomans existed. Likewise with on the Palestinian issue, it really goes back to Sykes-Picot, the McMahon Hussein agreement in 1914. Sykes-Picot, the McMahon Hussein correspondence, and the Balfour Declaration, all towards the end of World War One, when the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. So when these great empires broke apart, that is when this all started to happen. And she really, being that she was of Jewish descent, her family converted from Judaism to Catholicism, but still she was, during World War II, she was a target of ethnic cleansing. So she had a real heart and she had a real understanding of how bad ethnic cleansing could get and how bad it did get. And she put the pressure on Bill Clinton to put a stop to the ethnic cleansing in Eastern Europe. And she also, being that she was of Jewish descent, she had a unique, keen insight to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, kind of like Henry Kissinger. Now, you may not agree with her stance on it, or Henry Kissinger's stance on it, or her insistence to Colin Powell that we use military might to stop the Serbians from doing what they were doing. But given what she had witnessed, with the rise of Adolf Hitler in her own country, in Czechoslovakia, you can understand why she had that fear and why she had that apprehension. With regards to that. Now, one thing she failed at, that she wished she had put the pressure on the UN General Assembly and the UN troops to do more, was in East Africa. After the breakup of the Belgian Empire in East Africa, There was a lot of tension between the Hutu and the Tutsi population. The during the Belgian occupation of both Burundi and Rwanda, the Hutu population was put down. The Hutu population was oppressed by the Belgians and by the Tutsi population. So after the Belgians left in the 60s, by the time the 80s and 90s rolled around, particularly 1994, the Hutus, wanted to gain revenge, and they committed acts of genocide upon the Tutsis, and that was the worst genocide in our time. Think about it, guys. Us as Americans, we look at the 90s as a golden era because we had a little skirmish with Saddam Hussein in 1991, the first Gulf War. But we really look at the 90s as a golden era because we had won the Cold War. The Berlin Wall had come down. Eastern Europe was now free. And we weren't engaged in any global conflicts for the first time really in our history since the end of the War of 1812, right? So we kind of look at, even me as growing up as a kid back then, I kind of look at the 90s as a golden era too because it's it's sandwiched in between the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the War on Terror, which was in 2001 after 9/11. And it seemed like the world was for once at peace. Like I said, the Soviet Union had fell, Yugoslavia had broken up. There was no more empires, really, global empires around. It was as George H.W. Bush had said, it was a new world order. That's what we talk about. That's where that phrase came from. Initially, he was appropriating Woodrow Wilson, who thought with the establishment of the League of Nations in the 1930s, at the end of, in the early 1900s, at the end of World War One, that it would be a new world order. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. But it really was a new world order in the 90s, and we really look at it as a halcyon time in our history, us as Americans. But that's because we were isolated, guys. There were things going on. There were things brewing at the surface that were going on in Eastern Europe, going on in South Africa, and going on in other parts of Africa, civil wars in Africa, Eritrea gaining her independence from Ethiopia in the 90s, in 1993. So much stuff was going on in the 90s that Madeleine Albright was a part of this tumultuous time as a history-making woman, a woman who made history that we didn't even really recognize and we didn't really even know about, that we really couldn't even grasp. Why are the Bosnians and the Albanians fighting the Serbs? What significance does the Battle of Kosovo, a battle that happened in the 1390s, have to do with now? When the Ottoman Empire came in and defeated the Serbs, and then the Serbs felt slighted. And in fact, the Serbs themselves were persecuted in World War II when the Nazis had Waffen SS troops of Albanian and Bosnian descent. So they would want to turn back around after the end of Tito's rule in Yugoslavia, turn back around and commit an act of genocide. Why would they want to do that? We didn't really understand that. We didn't really grasp those kinds of nuances and those kinds of differences as far as Yugoslavia was concerned. To us, it was a time of peace. To us, it was a halcyon age. But the time that Madeleine Albright was really dealing with when she was Secretary of State was a really tumultuous time, a really crazy time. She also helping during the time that she was Secretary of State to garner the Good Friday deal in 1998 between the Northern Irish and the Irish Republic. So a lot of the things we talk about, a lot of the conflicts that we talk about here on this channel that was globally a thing in the 1990s in the post-Cold War era was stuff she was a part of, landmark achievements that she was a part of as a part of the Clinton administration. She received a Congressional Medal of Honor when under Barack Obama, and she continued to serve as a prominent figure up until the time she passed away, even weighing in on Vladimir Putin's invasion of the Ukraine. So she remained a brilliant woman, a brilliant political figure, a figure of political history that I will never forget. That was a huge part of me growing up as a kid, and me, even though living in the halcyon age of post Cold War America, still understanding what was going on at the time in terms of ethnic cleansing and ethnic divisions around the world through her prism, through understanding her and watching her speak on television. So rest in peace to Madeleine Albright, Madam Secretary. She blazed the trail for Hillary Clinton, who would become Secretary of State later on under Barack Obama. Now, people could say she was way better than Hillary Clinton. I think her insight as a woman coming from that area and all the conflicts, most of the conflicts in the 90s centered around that area of the former Yugoslavia, former Soviet Union area. That gave her keen insight that a lot of other people probably wouldn't have had at that time. Anyway, guys, peace. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hit the bell button to see when my next video is coming out. Love y'all.